Welcome back to Zenith Poker. Today we'll be continuing with our series on 2-bet pots between the big blind and the button. And today we're looking at the connected high boards. Specifically, we'll be looking at the lines with some checking involved, either the check back on the flop or check back on the turn or both. And then we'll look at the turnover of play accordingly. So let's jump right into it. I've got King 10-9 open here with the flush draw, check back frequency 45%. We'll look at the check back line first. Overall, in the turn report, checking through, we've got different cards bring different equities for the big blind, and the checking frequency is going to be proportional to the equity involved. So definitely the checking frequency for the big blind on the turn here is much lower when there is a flush turn card coming onto the board, because the button will bet many of their flush draws on the flop. So there's going to be a slight difference between the flush density for both players. Big blind will also have plenty of offsuit holdings with flush draws, so many of the hands in the big blind's range will improve with one of these flush cards coming on. Queen or a jack also brings plenty of straights for both players, and so it's going to improve the big blind's range. Checking much more often on a 10 or a 9 because the button will be checking back many of those ranks. So here, for example, on the flop, many of these middle pairs and 9x holdings are checking back, and the top pairs and stronger are going to be betting at a high frequency. So let's have a look at this 5 of spades. 5 of spades comes here on the turn. The big blind is checking 64.9%, so around 65%. They're betting for the pot size bet, half pot size bet. Pot size bet pretty frequently with a flush, straight, set, and some of the 2 pair combos as well. Top pair combos going for the half pot bet, well protected by the stronger ranks. So let's take a look at the response to these bets. Pot size bet here, button responds by folding around half the time. A half pot bet here responds by folding around a third of the time. Not a lot of raising involved. No real need to raise here. We've got 3 to a flush with 3 to a straight. So there's plenty of drawing hands in the button's range. Call, see the river. Some of those are going to improve. Some of those rivers are going to miss parts of the button's range. The big blind is going to check even for when they make the half pot bet or pot size bet. They're going to be checking a fair amount of the time or betting a different size a fair amount of the time, and the button being in position will respond appropriately to the big blind's either betting or checking depending on the size of the amount of chips that they put in. So say, for example, pot size bet, we've got a call, brick river here, got loads of sizes being used, even if it just goes pot size bet, and then we've got 2 hearts. We've got many of these ace highs going for the check give up, a lot of these weak hands going for the check give up, but because the bet on the turn was fairly polar, we get a brick river. Many of the strong hands on the turn are still quite strong here on the river, even though the button called with their entire continuing range. Flush density here, 19.6% compared to the sort of 9.22% here for the button. Flushes betting for this 2x pot bet at a pretty high frequency. Straight sets betting for the pot size bet. 2 pair betting a little bit smaller for the half pot bet, and these are weak 2 pairs betting for the quarter pot block bet. Weak pairs being used as a bluff. So for example here, the 5-3 blocks that 5x set, right? Blocks 2 pair 5-3, so 2 pair with 5-2, and many of these 5x hands can be used as a bluff to protect either the 2 pairs or the set of 5s. For example, similarly, a hand like all these 2x holdings are either flush, straight. Sorry, these are 2x holdings with the jack 2 we're able to flush, or they're a pair plus straight blocker. So here, for example, jack 2 being used in the pot size bet, it quite protects this, is used as a blocker for the set of 2s. Even though there's not going to be too many set of 2s remaining, there is going to be some, specifically with the spade calling this pot size bet here on the turn. And the other thing is it blocks the straight. So there's still plenty of straight, queen, jack, blocking that straight. It's pretty nice because the straight is going to snap off this bet, which the straight is being used. So here, the queen, jack, betting for this pot size bet. Makes sense to put the queen x, jack x combos as a bluff into that particular size, because the button is just going to snap call with those. If you don't have any other, say for example, flush blockers, you may prefer to use a queen or a jack to block that straight, to block that set, and those particular holdings are going to snap it off. At this stage in the tree, using one of these flush blockers when you've got 3 or flush isn't quite as good as you'd think, particularly with the ace flush blocker, because many of the ace flush blockers are going to be calling here on the turn. And so you actually end up blocking a bunch of folds, right? So say, for example, you go for a pot size bet. All of these ace-x combos with the ace of spades, right, that happily called the turn with a nut flush draw, are now just going to be folding the river. And there's far more of those than there are actually nut flushes. So when you use this particular hand as a bluff, say for example, ace-7 with the ace of spades, you actually end up blocking a lot of folds, and you don't end up blocking anywhere near as many calls as you'd like. This was fairly easy to over bluff because the main bet size that using these combo types makes sense in is the all-in. So you can just rip it in with your nut flush and nut flush blocker for this all-in, and you would get the nut flush to be the main hand, which is going to be calling there. And in these nut flush blocker scenarios, blocking the folds is not ideal, especially if you end up double blocking particular fold combos. So say, for example, here, the ace-4 with the ace of spades and a 4 blocks slightly fewer folding combos than like ace-8, because the ace-8 will end up blocking some additional folding combos with, say, for example, the pocket 8s here, 9-8, 10-8, etc. But the 4 doesn't really do that, because the 4 really only blocks this pocket 4s, and all of these other 4x combo flushes are just flushes, so they're not really blocked by your kicker. So be quite careful when you're choosing which combo of ace-x with the ace of spades to put into that jamming range. It's quite easy to block the wrong hands. All right, checking, for example, here after the pot size bet, the button will be indifferent between betting and checking many of these hands. Betting for the half pot size bet, you go for the half pot here, and there's lots of folding. So the range is quite polar by the time you get to the river like this. And so the big blind will be constructing their checking range to essentially cause a bluff value inversion here. There's all these ace highs being used as the bluff bet, right? And so there's not enough bluffing combos, and it's really these bluffing combos strongly plus EV to bluff, and many of these value combos are going to be indifferent. So say, for example, here you've got pocket jacks, for example, with 99% equity. Just because it has 99% equity doesn't mean that it's going to be clearly a value bet, because your opponent is going to massively overfold because you don't have enough bluffs. And in this particular scenario, you essentially don't get called by enough worse hands to justify betting pocket jacks all the time. So here it's going to be indifferent between betting and checking, and even hands like 2-pair with 99.5% equity will have similar issues. All right, in the half pot bet line and then the brick, similar scenarios with the ace of spades combos. Checking and then facing the half pot bet will also lead to a bluff value inversion. Some of these weak pairs are going to be making the hero call, but essentially these top pairs, pocket pair below top pairs, will be indifferent between betting and checking, despite the fact that they have enormous amounts of equity. The top pairs that went for the half pot bet here are going for a quarter pot bet here on the river as a block. They're going to get raised a lot of the time by the sets, 2 pairs, straights, going for a small raise, and the flushes are being used in this small size to protect those top pair holdings that take this line. If it checks through here on the turn, so say for example big blind checks, button needs to decide whether or not to bet, what size they're betting. They're going for the half pot bet a lot of the time. Going too much bigger means that you open yourself up to check raises. Going smaller means that you can't get enough value against a relatively merged range. So half pot is what you're left with as a decent option. Many of these top pairs will be indifferent between betting and checking because they will have to check back and then face a bet on the river. So for example, half pot bet, not a huge amount of check raising, but just enough to sort of toe the line between value and bluffs and just preventing the button from just blasting off here. If we get a check and then we get to the river like this, many of these top pair holdings will now be fairly happy with themselves after it bricks through. The button on the turn here with their 4.66% flushes and a few percentage of straights and stuff, those will all be betting at a relatively high frequency. So when it checks through and you get a brick to the river here like this, there's not going to be anywhere near as much hands stronger than a top pair. So these top pairs are going to be pretty happy with going for this pot size bet here on the river. So say, for example, king 8, king 3, they just go for the pot size bet, get plenty of value from many of these middle pairs, so 10x, 9x holdings. And of course, they're going to get raised by the flush and straight anyway. So taking a slightly different line with many of these top pairs isn't ideal because you're trying to get value, trying to get as much value as possible from your opponent's weakened range in this check down line. Doing anything else with these particular holdings, that doesn't make too much sense. Sizing up doesn't make too much sense because you miss out on value. You run to stronger hands too often. Betting too small doesn't make too much sense because you're still going to run to those stronger hands anyway, but you're not getting as big of a final pot against the weaker holdings, which your opponent has much more combinations of. And then when you get raised, many of your top pairs are going to be close to indifferent anyway. So it's important to size the river bet correctly in order to maximize your value. Middle pairs, weak pairs, sizing a bit smaller, trying to get value from different parts of the button's checking range here. These two pair combos, particularly stuff like the king 2, 10, 5, so it doesn't really block anything, goes for the 2x pop bet. Flushes and straights being used to protect those different sizes. So say, for example, here, quarter pot, you face like a half pot raise, you've got a straight or a flush, you're going for the 3-bet. You face a slightly bigger raise, the straights can go for a small 3-bet, two pairs going for the call, flushes ripping it in sometimes. Very important to use your remaining strong hands that you're trying to check raise here on the turn into the different lines here on the river. So you failed at your flop check raise, you failed at your turn check raise. It's important to use these hands to protect remaining holdings in the rest of your range, because these hands, they're not going to get there to this particular line very often because they'll be bet on the flop on the turn. And so anything that's remaining is going to be a very small number of combos. You need to use that to protect the remainder of your range. So here, for example, narrowing down the flushes, they're betting more often than they're checking, of course, but they're still taking all the main sizes that the remaining hands are taking. All right, let's look at another board for comparison. So that was a board with a sort of relatively high check back frequency on the flop. We'll look at a board with a relatively high betting frequency. So, for example, look at this King Queen 9. King Queen 9 got a pretty high betting frequency for the half pot and quarter pot. So let's have a look at the half pot bet call. Some raises, of course, under the big blind. Look at the turn report. A little bit of donking, 8% donking throughout. Donking more on the 10 and the 9. The 9 in particular, because many of the 9x are just going to go for the call on the flop. And so bringing the 9 brings trips to plenty of the big blind's range. The 10, the jack, completes many of the straights. 10 in particular completes the jack X straight. There's going to be plenty of jack X in the big blind's check call range, and some of the ace jack offsuit will make it in there as well. There's no ace jack suited in the big blind's range. That always throws pre-flop. Ace jack offsuit is the remaining hand, and there's a fair amount of ace jack offsuit. And so if the 10 comes, then jack offsuit is the nuts. The jack comes, ace 10 offsuit is the nuts. There's plenty of ace 10 as well. All right, so let's have a look at it bricking through. Bricks on the turn, checks through. Button will continue betting, of course. We've already looked at the 3-barrel line, so we won't spend too much time on that. The hands that are checking back here after the half pot flop bet, mainly going to be these sort of middle pairs, weak pairs, ace highs. A lot of hands are giving up here. So many of these unmade hands that haven't improved on the turn are going to be giving up. Slightly bigger size, pot size bet here being used. The 3 doesn't really improve anything in our players' ranges. The big blind didn't check raise. Many of the stronger hands have been put into the check raise line rather than check call line. And so the button will essentially go for the pot size bet here on the turn and then start in the river. So say we'll just look at it quickly. Pot size bet, suit like 2, check, and then these 2 pairs, sets, straights, rip it in, top pairs checking back. So check back here on the turn, get the 2 of diamonds in. After it goes check, check, the button will have missed a lot of their holdings. Many of these middle pair combos in the big blinds range will go for a block bet. So here, for example, quarter pot bet. And you're trying to get called by the weaker pairs. So many of these 9x holdings, the pocket jacks, pocket 10s, obviously any queen is going to snap it off because the queen is the value in this range. A lot of overfolding against the quarter pot bet because many of these hands here are just bluffs on the flop that are giving up rather than bluff catches. There are still a few bluff catches. Some of these ace highs can go for a hero call against the bluffing combos here. Which hands are being used as a bluff? It's the hands that they make sense. These hands like Jack X, 10X, just calling this half pot flop bet, particularly with, say, for example, backdoor flush draw or whatever. These hands just going for the call for the half pot flop bet, checks through on the turn, they miss, and so they're essentially going to have to bluff the river. Some of the ace highs being thrown as a bluff as well at low frequencies, and that kind of just prevents anything weaker than an ace high from going for the hero call. So say, for example, this like Jack 8 can't profitably call. You can potentially go for a bluff raise, but not really going for a call at all. Middle pairs, top pairs, etc., all going for value at some frequency. The Jack X, sorry, the 9X combos here, third pair, mostly going for a check. Basically any pair checking, hoping to check back against the ace high or the missed bluff. Many of those hands are checking back. These Queen X combos going for the half pot value bet here against the 9 and against these lower pocket pairs. Those lower pocket pairs are just going to give up. It's mainly the 9 that's going to be doing any hero calling. Ace high is going to be doing some hero calling. Ace 10, Ace Jack doing some hero calling. And then the two pairs, particularly with the 9 that have been allocated here, these two pair combinations with a 9 work really well in protecting the checking range because they block the 9x checkbacks. All these 9x combos are basically going to be checking back. So if you have a two pair that blocks the 9, you block your opponent's checkbacks and your opponent is more likely to bet into you. So your check rate is going to be more successful. Checking here, half pot bet. These two pairs spring the trap and go for the check raise. Facing a bigger bet. King 9 goes to check raise. The Queen 9 just goes for the check call quite happily there because of the strong blocking effects against stronger two pairs, for example. Stronger two pairs, we're talking about that King 9, some of the sets with the set of queens as well, making it into this line. And of course, the straights being allocated to all three sizes. So the three main sizes here, the quarter pot, half pot, and pot size bet, as well as some of the checking. The half pot bet being taken with the weaker king. All right, let's have a look at a slightly different line now. After we get, so for example, a check call and then the jack. Check call and a jack 4 to a straight. The big blind's going to have some donking, some bigger donks with the S10, and then some smaller donks with the Jack X combos and two pair combos for value. Top pair combos is a bit of a block there. So like you're taking this line here, like this, quarter pot and then brick. These straights going for the quarter pot again, right? So just quarter pot. Opponents straights are essentially going to be calling you or going for a semi-bluff raise with S10, pocket 10s. But many of these two pair combos are just going to call down. These top pair combos are just going to call down. Can't really fold against the bets these small. Otherwise, you end up letting these bluffs just print. The strong hands like the Ace 10 alongside some of the 10x combos with some additional equity. For example, this Queen 10 here with the flush draw. Some of these weak pairs just rip it in. And then all these 10x combos are indifferent here on the turn. Sorry, on the river here. You rip it in for the 6x pot jam. So that's one way to make value with your Ace 10. Of course, you can use your Ace 10 in plenty of different ways besides just ripping it in. You can go for a check and then face a bet, and now you rip it in quite happily, using all these remaining straights as a Ace 10/10x block, trying to get the chop to fold essentially, or the set's going to fold. Trying to get chop to fold, so all these 10x combos, just ripping it in, slight remaining weak pocket pairs being thrown in there as well. If it checks here on the turn, the button is going to be playing sort of similarly to the big blind, same sorts of hands going for the quarter pot bet. These are top pairs, over pairs with the aces, going for a cheeky quarter pot bet here. Mainly their intention is to essentially check back here on the river, so many of these top pairs are being allocated to this quarter pot size alongside some of the two pairs, three of a kinds, weaker straight combos as an in-position block bet here on the turn. Not super likely to improve, but because the blind doesn't go for the check raise in this particular setup too often because they need a lot of their 10x to protect the next street, the button can take a line where they go for really thin value, not expecting worse to call too often. So here, for example, top pairs got 40% equity, ace got 40% equity, and then check back the next straight. So it is a value bet of some sort, but you're comparing the two lines, betting here for the quarter pot size, checking back the river, versus checking back here on the turn and then potentially facing a bet on the river some of these two pairs, for example, here going for the quarter pot bet themselves. Aces are going to call, ace king is going to call, and then stronger hands like stronger two pairs. Suddenly your aces is indifferent, your ace king is not really liking it, although it does still going to have to call because of the blocker effects of the king. And now the straights for the pot size bet makes essentially all of your top pairs, two pairs sets indifferent because you're saying you've got a straight or you're bluffing. And then of course ace 10 here for the button just rips it on top, rips it over the top, and all these remaining straights are indifferent. They're jamming over the top with a combination of the ace 10 and the 10x as the chop bluff. Two bet going for the quarter pot bet in this check down line here. So half pot bet on the flop, call, see the jack, checks are on the turn, and then two pairs blocking for a quarter pot bet. Many of these top pairs, middle pairs checking, hoping to get to showdown against the same sorts of hands, and potentially ace highs, which give up here on the for the flop. So make for this flop bet here, and now just checking down and giving up. There is still plenty of that because essentially, in order to make your opponent indifferent here on the flop, you need sufficient number of bluffs, and these runouts are going to be fairly give up heavy after you've bet on an earlier street and then check the turn. So betting the flop and then checking the turn is a fairly give up heavy line for the buttons. You would expect the big blind to be pretty happy with here in this particular run out, checking like a 9 and then getting to showdown against either a weaker pair or like a 9 potentially chopping, or an ace high type combination. Like these unmade hands, yeah, maybe these hands can go for a bluff, but there's you got to be pretty careful not to over bluff because you've got so many hands that you're giving up here with here. All right, so let's call that the end of this video. So we've covered a couple of different boards and many of the check down lines. We've got plenty of checking throughout. The checks on the flop aren't quite as common, but after a flop bet, there's going to be plenty of checking happening on the turn, and then you're going to be playing the river with essentially a range with plenty of give ups for either player. All right, thanks for joining me for this lesson. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.